Oh, I better check. Yes, continue. Okay.
There we go. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to everybody for joining us today. Thanks especially to Professor Stan Rosen. Stanley Rosen is joining us from University of Southern California. I want to thank everybody also for early on for your patience with the Zoom settings. The Zoom settings are unfortunately necessary for our meetings. You can type any questions at any point into the chat. I will see those and sift through them. And after Professor Rosen's initial remarks are completed, I'll also welcome you to raise your hand virtually or indicate in the chat that you'd like to ask a question live. And then I can adjust the Zoom settings so that we don't have any, in the meantime, until then, we don't have any accidental unmutings or disruptions. And again, I apologize and appreciate everybody's patience for this process. Today's event is made possible by the History Department, the History Club, College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, the Senior Faculty Research Fellowship, the Intellectual Life Fund, and academic programs. And again, as always, I want to especially thank Pamela Crossan in the History Department office for making all of these events possible with all of her expertise and her time in getting us, keeping us going. Today's guest speaker is Professor Stanley Rosen, and the title of his talk is Hollywood in China and China in Hollywood. Will it be back to business as usual post-pandemic, or have the relationships changed? It's a great pleasure to share Professor Rosen's work today. He's a professor of political science in the Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences at the University of Southern California. He's a specialist on politics in the People's Republic of China, Chinese film, and Chinese society. He received his BA in English and pre-med from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and his MA and PhD in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles. He was the faculty mentor of University Residential College at BIMCRANT, which is an honors college for USC's best incoming students from 2011 to 2017. He's lived on campus for 29 years as a residential faculty member. Mr. USC, I think, would be the title.
But I would say I'm not living on campus anymore because after 29 years, they kicked me out. They said we have term limits. We're finally enforcing our 4-year term limit.
Well, I think Mr. USC is an apt title. Professor Rosen studied Chinese in Taiwan and Hong Kong and has traveled to the mainland China around 80 times in the last 40 years. A selection of his many books will be available to click in the chat in a few moments and also in the description. He's written on such topics as the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese legal system, public opinion, youth, gender, human rights, Sino-American relations, and as we'll hear today, film and the media. He's been the editor, now the co-editor of Chinese Education and Society since 1983. A few of his most recent books are Soft Power with Chinese Characteristics, China's Campaign for Hearts and Minds, Chinese Politics, State, Society, and the Market, co-edited with Peter Hayes Grease, and Art, Politics, and Commerce in Chinese Cinema, co-edited with Ying Zhu. In addition to his academic activities at USC, Professor Rosen has escorted 13 delegations to China for the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. He's an affiliated research scholar at Beijing Normal University, which is cool, Beishida. I went there for a year, the best school, of course. The Research Institute for Chinese Culture and International Communications, and a member of the International Advisory Board of Shanghai University's Center for Media Studies and the Humanities Studies at Zhongshan University in Taiwan. He's consulted for the World Bank, the Ford Foundation, the United States Information Agency, the Los Angeles Public Defender's Office, and a number of private corporations, law firms, and US government agencies. If I listed all of his publications and his grants and awards, we would be here all afternoon, but I quickly want to note the Taiwan Documentary Film Award from the Taiwan Ministry of Culture, and also the UCLA USC Joint East Asian Studies Center grant from the U.S. Department of Education with Bin Wong, twice awarded, as well as the Freeman Foundation Undergraduate Asian Studies Initiative from the Freeman Foundation. Again, I'll post some more information about Professor Rosen in the chat, but without further ado, I want to welcome Stanley Rosen, and please join me in giving Professor Rosen a virtual welcome. Thank you, Stan.
Thanks, Jeremy. After that introduction, I'm going to hire you as my public relations specialist. Am I loud enough? Could everybody hear me, right, Jeremy? Okay, good.
Yes, great.
Okay, so I'm watching the time because you may notice that since I'm sharing the screen, I have 106 slides, which I am not planning to go through. Not all of them, certainly, but I'll make sure to stop to give plenty of time for discussions. I hope to get into the 40s maybe if I go quickly enough, but fortunately a lot of stuff is on the screen. You'll also see that a number of slides have Chinese on them. A few slides have Chinese with no English, but most the slides have Chinese because I've given lectures in China on this and other subjects related to film, which is one of the areas you can still lecture on in China without running into too many obstacles, political obstacles. And so let me start, and you see the title up there. So let me start with a couple of quick conclusions. And again, you can see it on the screen, but I think I would argue that much of what is going to happen after the pandemic was already trending before the pandemic. What the COVID-19 has done is simply exacerbated the increasing bifurcation of the Chinese film market and the American or North American film market, and the international film market for that matter. So the Chinese market is becoming more similar to the American or the Indian markets in terms of market share for domestic films. Also, not going to be enough time to talk about this, but streaming has become much more important, particularly in North America, and the traditional theatrical model is under increasing pressure. So there will be continuing experiments with streaming. I'll also talk about what does Hollywood want from China, what does China want from Hollywood, talk about the continuing structural constraints in both markets. So it's going to be difficult for either country to increase market share in the market of the other country. I'll talk about briefly, I guess, Hollywood's disadvantages in China and China's disadvantages in Hollywood going forward. And clearly the failures of the Great Wall and Mulan, Great Wall failure in the international market, the North American market particularly, and the failure of Mulan in the China market shows the difficulties of creating these mega budget films with Chinese themes that will succeed in both markets. So those are some of the things. Now, I've got a couple of other slides on conclusions. These conclusions are more about the lack of Chinese success outside China. I've got a piece coming out in a chapter in a book called The China Questions, second edition, which will be coming out probably about August or September. They asked me to do a chapter on why is Chinese popular culture not so popular outside China. And so these conclusions really deal with that issue. The lack of transparency on film censorship, other issues, which I hope to get a chance to talk about today, has damaged Chinese soft power and its success overseas. Chinese films are made primarily for the domestic market. They understand they have little chance on the international market. There was a period of time, 2 periods of time, where there was a lot of optimism about Chinese films doing well outside China, North America and Europe. And that was from 2001, 2006, and I'll show you some statistics about that. And in 2016, 2017, China's influence was increasing. And I'll say a couple of things about that. They've tried a lot of strategies. Famous American actors like Christian Bale, for example, didn't work. Chinese box office blockbusters, which do well in China, which tend to be patriotic films or comedies, appeal only to Chinese students and others, originally from China, not to Westerners, so that hasn't worked. The co-productions that have worked in both markets are very few, and they tend to be more Hollywood films than Chinese films. The two that have been most successful, I would say, are The Meg, which is about a big shark. And that's not really a Chinese film as far as I'm concerned. And the other is Forbidden Kingdom with Jackie Chan and Jet Li. And that was, again, a special case that did well in both markets. But there are more failures than successes. I'd also argue, and I wrote an article on this at one point, Hollywood films make a much better case for China than China's own films, because Hollywood is in the business, in a sense, of selling out. And so they've, that's how they cash in. So they've actually put very favorable things in films like The Martian, for example, 2012, Transformers 4, favorable film, favorable mentions of China in some of these big blockbusters to help get the China market. And so they tend to make a better case than China's own films because people actually see these Hollywood films. Art house films do well in film festivals, not at the box office. I have lectured in China on how China can improve its standing overseas, its success overseas, and I've always argued animation, going back many years, animation is their best hope. I can get into that if there are questions. I would also note that Hollywood films about China or Chinese people that are box office hits influence China's overseas image more than China's own films. And here I point to films like Crazy Rich Asians. The Fan Bingbing tax evasion case. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with that. We can talk about that too in the Q&A if you're interested. They show that the government has much higher priorities than overseas film success because Fan Bingbing was China's most effective representative internationally, and she was sidelined for many months and had to pay 129 million US dollars in fines because of so-called what they call yin-yang contracts, where you sign two contracts, one which is public and the other, the secret contract, is what you're actually being paid, so you can avoid paying taxes. And now the domestic market for Chinese films is so much better than for Hollywood imports, does China really need the overseas market? Okay. What China wants from Hollywood: tell Chinese stories well in North America and elsewhere, improve Chinese storytelling, benefit from other Hollywood strengths like special effects, try and make films which are high concept films that play well in different cultures. I've highlighted China seeks recognition on the global stage, including the Oscars, because of the recent Chloe Jiao phenomenon, which I'll talk about briefly. And there have been collaborations. Wolf Warrior 2, which is the biggest hit of all time in China, shows how collaborations can work because the Russo brothers, who did Captain America and the Avengers films, some of the Avengers films, were consultants on that film. Again, I talk more about that if there's time. Now, after the 2019 Oscars, China, Xinhua News Agency, and other official Chinese sources pointed to Green Book, which won Best Film at the Oscars in 2019, and other films like Bao, Minding the Gap, and Free Solo, saying that each of these films is connected to China. And so they said a palpable undercurrent to the Academy Awards in 2019 is the growing presence of Chinese companies and filmmakers of Chinese origin on the global entertainment scene. The 91st Academy Awards can be viewed as a starting point for a new period of growing influence for China international film industry. Well, to me, that's completely ridiculous because Alibaba did give some funding for Green Book, but had no creative input. And the other three films, all of these filmmakers either were born outside China or came to Canada or the US at the age of 2 or the age of 5. So China's claiming credit for individual creative awards won by artists simply because of their ethnicity. But this is also very ironic because now we have the case of Chloe Jiao, and this is something I took from the web right after social media in China began to attack her. She went in a few short days from being the pride of China to disgracing China after the win at the Golden Globes because someone dug up, one of the netizens on social media dug up an interview she had done for Filmmaker magazine back in 2013. in which she said, and this goes well back before she started making films people were really watching. She said, I'm making my films real as I can, because growing up in China, I realized that there are lies everywhere. So somebody dug that up. And then there was another interview she gave in an Australian magazine, which misquoted her as saying she's an American when she actually said she's not an American, she's Chinese. So they corrected that later. But anyway, there was all this public opinion outrage at her after it started off saying she's the pride of China. She's very, very good for China. But then all of a sudden, so even when China gets the recognition they've craved so much, there's always some kind of monkey wrench thrown into the works. And then you have Nomad Land winning. And New York Times, Wall Street Journal, a lot of places have talked about that. She became the first woman of color, the first Chinese woman to win the Oscar for Best Director. But you can't search for that in China. There are a lot of congratulatory messages on Chinese social media sites when it was announced on Monday morning by Beijing time. By mid-afternoon, all the posts pretty much had been erased. And journalists were told by the propaganda ministry not to report on her victory because of all this public opinion on social media. So anybody who says the Chinese government is not concerned about public opinion obviously is not paying attention. When I spoke to the Wall Street Journal about this, a couple of things I said, a basic contradiction between wanting to claim credit for someone born in Beijing who has succeeded in the West in a creative field, but also wanted to control the message of how great and successful China is. There's a basic contradiction there, especially since this year is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. They don't want any distractions in public opinion. They want everything completely controlled. I think that's one of the biggest obstacles to China's development of its soft power or image or brand overseas, the need to control everything, nothing left to chance. China's disadvantage, the one thing I will mention is that if you look at the all-time 100 most successful films on the international market, all but one of them are Hollywood films. Wolf Warrior 2 is at number 73, but the box office is 99.9% in China. But that's the only one in the top 100 all time on the international market. I mentioned about Fan Bingbing, and I mentioned about how China in 2016, 2017 was beginning to make inroads into Hollywood, into the United States. And here's Time magazine cover in 2017, how China aims to take over Hollywood with Fan Bingbing on the cover. And in fact, Washington Post in 2016 talked about how China's influence over Hollywood was growing, but in the same article, they noted that in September 2016, 16 members of Congress talked about the concerns about China's efforts to censor topics and exert propaganda controls on American media, as Dalian Wanda, Wang Jianlin, the CEO, was very vocal in saying he's going to buy a Hollywood studio and money is no object. And the reason he was doing that is to highlight the China element in the films in which it invests, influence the global film industry, set a good precedent for Chinese film producers in their international investments, and also talked about enhancing China's soft power. So there was this big pushback beginning in the last part of 2016. This is a slide is taken about a meeting that actually the first nationwide film industry symposium that took place in 2019 after the Central Propaganda Department had taken over the Film Bureau. And so everything was now under the Central Propaganda Department. And they had all the top film directors, film stars, producers, and so on CEOs of Chinese companies and studios. And the person in charge of the Film Bureau said, filmmakers, film studios should take the Chinese dream of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation as their theme and have patriotic plots. They have to have a clear ideological bottom line, cannot challenge the political system. The problem with all that, because he says the international influence of Chinese film has a long way to go, comparing how American films do in China versus how Chinese films do in North America. And he basically is telling filmmakers to make films which have socialist core values, patriotic plots, but who outside China is going to want to see these films? So there's a basic contradiction in China's strategy. Here's another example, very quickly. After Chiang Kai, a film director from the Hubei Film Studio, died, I looked up his obituary online, and it only talks about his political position and his desire to be a Communist Party member. There's nothing at all is said about his creative work. And again, this is why, one of the reasons China has trouble in marketing its films overseas, because film, culture in general, everything else for that matter, is second to controlling the political message. Politics isn't really in command, as General Mao said. Mao said, "Zheng zhi guo shuai." Politics in command in China. If you look at the foreign language films all time at the North American box office, you find Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, #1, made more than twice as much as any other film ever marketed in North America. And 5 of the top 15 are Chinese films, but nothing since 2006. The last Chinese film that did really well was Jet Li's Fearless in September 2006. And you can see that Chinese films in those days, from December 2000 to September 2006, were different from the martial arts films were different from other foreign language films playing in North America, because they played on over 2,000 screens. Or close to 2,000 screens, up to 2,500 screens. And all the other foreign language films, even really successful ones like Life is Beautiful, had nowhere near that penetration. So that was a high tide, Chinese martial arts films. And I can talk about again in Q&A why that declined if people are interested. Sorry, this slide is only in Chinese, of course, from a Chinese source. But the overseas box office of Chinese films, most successful film by country, you still see Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, even though it's over 20 years old now, is still the #1 Chinese film in virtually every European country, and many other countries as well. There are some exceptions. Again, if I had time, I would talk about it country by country. If you look at the worldwide box office all time, you find of the top 10 films, 4 of those films are Avengers films. But you see, aside from Avatar and Titanic, and now Avatar will have 3 more Avatar films coming up, James Cameron is doing, but you find they're all franchise films. They're called tentpole films, sequel films. And here's the second 10, except for animated films, which also do well internationally. And you also notice that often you'll have overseas box office of close to 70%, sometimes more than 70%. In fact, of the top 20, only Black Panther with 48% overseas had less than 50% box office outside North America. So again, it's very hard for China to compete with that. As I said, the only film in the top 100 not from Hollywood is Wolf Warrior 2. You look at the 2021 worldwide box office, dominated by Chinese films. Domestic means North America so far, and you see 100%, and this means China. Godzilla vs. Kong, of course, was played not just in China, but again, the overseas box office, China's a very big part of that, close to 79%. Worldwide box office 2020, I have the 800 here is #1. And the reason I put that in was because the 800 was a very interesting film in China, the way it was treated. This is the box office in 2020. Again, 99.9% was really the Chinese market. Less than 0.1% was in North America. Made $372,000 in North America, and again, didn't do well elsewhere. It's a patriotic Chinese film. But if you look at what happened to the 800, again, there's no time to go into detail on that because it's already 12:27. It was supposed to be the opening film at the Shanghai International Film Festival in 2019, but it was pulled at the last minute. And again, China never tells you why they're pulling films, except it's technical reasons. But it seems to be that it's a chapter in Sino-Japanese War in which the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, were the heroes, not Mao's Communist Party. And since you had the 70th anniversary of Mao's victory over the Kuomintang that year, coming out in October, again, this would be a distraction. So it was pulled. They made some cuts. And then it was finally released, an $80 million film. China, the only reason I put China box office in 2020, and this is from Box Office Mojo, which made a big mistake because they left off the 800, which should be number one, left off their list. But Mulan is at number 14, made $40 million in China. Here's a $200 million film, which was supposed to be marketed in China to make back that money, and completely bombed, and a lot of reasons why it failed. But it was, you could say it was predictable, because what you're doing with Mulan, made by a director from New Zealand, screenwriters are all Westerners, even though the stars, obviously, everybody in the cast is Chinese, the story is very Chinese. But in effect, what you're doing is telling China, we're making a film, Mulan, which you've made many times, and we actually made it as an animated film, Disney did earlier. And we're making a live action Mulan film with Westerners creating the film to tell your story better than you can tell it yourself. So people were already prepared to be hypercritical about the historical accuracy of the film, the costumes, the housing. In fact, people were very critical of the housing. Was really hundreds of years out of date compared to the time period it's supposed to take place. So it was really hubris on the part of Disney to try and sell that film the way they did in China. The all-time box office in China, you see that Hollywood films, Avengers at number 6, one of the Fast and Furious films at number 15, but the other films are all Chinese films. So the market is getting tougher and tougher for Hollywood. Yearly box office, I can go through this quickly. Yearly box office in 2019, the last year really pre-pandemic, China was already dominating their market. You have Avengers Endgame and Fast and Furious presents Hobbs and Shaw, and then Spider-Man, but that's basically it. 2018, you have a few Western films in red, mostly Chinese films. Second half, 13 to 24, you have more Western films. 2017, again, you don't have that many Hollywood films. The majority of the successful Hollywood films are in the 11 to 20 range. You have a quota system where 34 imported films can be taken in China on a cost-sharing basis. In 2016, Hollywood did better. But you can see from this chart here, Hollywood's decline in China post-pandemic. This is through October 2020, going back to 2016. Now, these are all imported films, so you can see that other imported films, including Indian films, Japanese films, were beginning to cut in to Hollywood's domination of imported films, but domestic films were by 2018 already making over 64% of the market. By 2020, it was really over 80%. That was a special year, of course. Look at the box office growth, annual growth rate between China and North America. You see that the Chinese box office growth rate, although in decline overall, is still much better than the growth rate in North America. So even without the pandemic, China would be the world's largest film market within a year or two anyway. I'm putting up these slides because you see a box office by holidays and cities. Almost 50% of the tickets sold in China by 2019 were for the Lunar New Year, what the Chinese call the Spring Festival, summer vacation, National Day around October 1st, and the regular New Year, the end of the year. And for the most part, those are reserved for domestic films. Like Spring Festival, National Day, definitely you don't want any imported films when you're showing these big Chinese blockbusters. So that's one reason why it's difficult for Hollywood to compete. And if you look at the cities, the smaller cities, tier 4 cities, have now got more than 25% of the market. And the largest cities are declining in terms of market share. And that's where Hollywood films do well. They don't do well in the tier 3 and tier 4 cities. Imported films are not as successful. You also see that blockbuster films in China are taking an increasing share of the market, 37% by 2019. Again, that benefits Chinese films more than imported films. Now, this looks at breakdown of imported buyout films. And these are films that are sold on a flat fee basis, unlike the quota system where you have 34 films. Sometimes it's extended beyond that, but it's normally 34 films on a revenue sharing basis where the imported film gets 25% of the market. These buyout films, you can show as often as you want once you pay a flat fee. There are some complications, there are hybrid models, but these are the two basic models. You see that for the buyout films, Japan was more successful than the United States in 2019. And you also see, I put on this chart, in 2019, there were 14 new installments of Hollywood franchise films, sequels, released in China, but only 6 of the 14, 42.9%, performed better than the previous film in that franchise at the box office. And if you look at the imported buyout films 2019, the top 3 were Spirited Away, which is a much earlier film that was finally allowed to be shown in China. That was number 1. The Miyazaki animated film, a Green Book, which had Alibaba funding to some extent, and that's why it was promoted. Alibaba, of course, has the biggest ticket selling operation, so they could promote that. And the Lebanese-French US film, Capernaum. 6 imported Japanese animation movies brought in more than 100 million renminbi in China that year. So Hollywood faces competition from other countries as well in the China market, in addition to domestic Chinese competition. I thought The Wandering Earth, I don't know how many people have seen that, but The Wandering Earth was a big success in China, making almost $700 million US dollars in China. It did well for a Chinese film in North America. It made close to $6 million, and Netflix has been promoting it as well. But if you look at this slide, you could put on your ticket any number of things, but here's a ticket that says only the Communist Party can save the Earth. Now, if you haven't seen Wandering Earth or read the book, you wouldn't know that. But this was, again, made into a patriotic film. As The Economist put it, in many, and this gives an example of why films from China don't play so well overseas. The Economist says this film can be interpreted as a parable of the Chinese government's idea of multilateralism. Chinese heroes trying to save the world are always seeking the partnership of foreigners in the film. Just as China's officials always talk about joining hands with other countries to solve global problems and reach win-win outcomes. Yet there's always a caveat. China must be the leader in any multilateral initiative. In the film, rescue teams from the likes of Britain and Japan dutifully answer the call of Chinese team leaders. No Americans are featured at any point. Even in the world, ethereal world of sci-fi, the Chinese government remains firmly in control of things. And here's my note on that. And by the way, there's a lot of stereotypes in the film. For example, when things are not going well and it looks like it's the world's going to be destroyed. The Japanese commit suicide. They just kill themselves. I mean, very stereotypical things in the film. But here's my note, because I've read the novella, Liu Cixin's novella in which it's based. It takes place 400 years after it's discovered the sun will expand to destroy the solar system. In the film, it takes place, in the near future. There's a big difference because you have 400 years to prepare to deal with the fact that the sun will destroy the solar system. What do you do in those 400 years? So in the book, it's actually a novella. It's only 48 pages. It's a novella. There are protests. There are conspiracy theories. Governments Chinese government is actually attack government leaders. They're forced to kill themselves. There are no countries that appear, no countries at all that are named in the novel, the novella. Certainly no cooperating countries. There's a ridicule of religious beliefs, as it says in the book. No one believed in God anymore because everyone felt that if God existed, he must be a real bastard. So there are no heroes. Liu Cixin, I've read a lot of Liu Cixin. I've read his 3-body trilogy, 1,500 pages. I've read a lot of his stuff. And he's a very cynical person in terms of public opinion and what you can trust, what you can believe. And the film changes that completely. Okay? Now you have the Great Wall. And one reason, among others, why the Great Wall was not successful, even before anybody had seen the film, there was an attack of whitewashing. Why is Matt Damon saving China, ancient China anyway? Can't the Chinese do that themselves? To me, that's a big irony because in the Great Wall, this is more of a Chinese film than any major co-production between the U.S. and China has ever been. The movie was hailed in China as being the first of its kind to be made by a major Chinese director. It's backed by a Chinese-owned Hollywood studio, Legendary, owned by Dalian Wanda. If successful, it could be a big step forward for the influence of the Chinese film industry around the world. China's leading director, Zhang Yimou, who made the film, defended the Great Wall. He said it's the opposite of what's being suggested. It's not whitewashing. For the first time, you have a film deeply rooted in Chinese culture, one of the largest Chinese casts ever assembled, made it a tentpole or franchise film scale for world audience. Matt Damon is not playing a role that was originally conceived for a Chinese actor. You have to have a leading international actor when you're spending $175 million, even before marketing and promotion, just to make the film. To me, there's another irony, which I don't mention in this slide, but Matt Damon is not saving China in the film. The film is saving Matt Damon. He goes to China as a mercenary, having fought for 10 different flags, as he puts it, 10 different countries or territories. He's illiterate, but within the space of a day or two, he learns the Chinese concept of Xinren, or trust, and becomes more Chinese than the Chinese in some ways in believing in Chinese culture. Whereas the character played by Willem Dafoe, who's been in China for 25 years and teaching everybody English for some reason, why anybody would learn English during the Ming Dynasty in China is never said, but presumably it explains why 80% of the film is in English. But you have Willem Dafoe playing a character who is presumably imbibed some Chinese culture in his 25 years there, teaching English to all of the Chinese that he is in contact with, but he doesn't change at all. He went there to steal Chinese gunpowder, and he tries to steal Chinese gunpowder 25 years later. Whereas Matt Damon, an illiterate mercenary, goes there and in a day or two understands Chinese culture so fully, he accepts the Chinese concept of trust. So a lot of things are very laughable in that film. It's got good action scenes, but this was an attempt to make a film that will appeal in the Chinese market and the overseas market, and very hard to do both. Again, 2019, the last year before the pandemic, really. If you look at the Spring Festival and Lunar New Year period, 3 of the top 4 films internationally were Chinese films. Again, showing the importance of the Chinese market. Also, if you look at the all-time top 10 international box office hits not in English, 9 of the top 10 are Chinese, just for the Chinese film market, except for Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. They're all Chinese films. So Chinese film market is not to be taken lightly. It's very important. Different models of Chinese film and why they're not successful. Feng Xiaogang, Zhang Yimou, two leading filmmakers, have tried making period pieces using famous American actors. You had Flowers of War with Christian Bale. You had Back to 1942 or 1942 with Adrian Brody and Tim Robbins. But you're making films, historical epics, dealing with very, very bad situations. Hunan Famine of 1942, Nanjing Massacre of 1937. Why would foreigners go to see such films? If you're going to pay $20 million to Christian Bale, make a film that's entertaining and not just about Japanese atrocities during the Second World War, which people will take as a propaganda film if they don't know anything about the Nanjing Massacre of 1937. Wang Kar-wai, Wang Jiao made The Grandmaster, which I'll talk about in the next slide very briefly. Jia Zhangke, but again, that's not going to, the big expensive promotion, millions of dollars promoting. Harvey Weinstein spent millions of dollars promoting and marketing the film. Jia Zhangke makes films which are great, but people don't go to see. They're art house films. Comedies and patriotic films don't work outside China. Very quickly on this slide, and I'm almost done, fortunately, it's 12:44. Zhang Yimou's films, aside from The Great Wall, which is kind of an aberration, Zhang Yimou's films were predictable. The classic films like Razor Red Latin, To Live, Shanghai Triad, Judo, Story of Choju, all made between 1991 and 95, made about $2 to $2.5 million in the North American market. So he was a predictable filmmaker in terms of market in North America. Then you have the big martial arts craze with Hero, House of Flying Daggers, Curse of the Golden Flower. That did much better during that period from 2001 to 2006. But since then, he hasn't really done well. The Grandmaster, I mentioned Wong Kar-wai with a big budget, but the US version is 22 minutes shorter than the Chinese version. They put intertitles to explain Chinese history. They have on-screen identification of the characters as a voiceover by Tony Leung. A lot of changes made, but again, the best it could do was about 6.6 million, which is the best any Chinese film has done since 2006. But it doesn't justify the marketing budget for that film. This, if I had time, I'd do a hyperlink. At the Berlin Film Festival in 2019, Zhang Yimou's film about the Cultural Revolution, 1 Second, was supposed to show, and it was pulled at the very last minute. So Julie Binoche and the entire Berlin Film Festival jury went on stage to say, we're really disappointed that this film is not being shown. We look forward to seeing the film. Everybody knows Zhang Yimou is a great film. So China really hurt itself by pulling this film at the last minute because it led to a whole series of articles in the industry and film trade magazine, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere. What will become of this film? Why is it being censored? China's censors confound business. They have all sorts of reasons I can go into if there's time. Speculation why it's being censored, but China really hurts itself by doing this. Maybe a couple of last slides and then I'll stop because it's 12:46. One thing China does to improve its market is to have these young actors, what the Chinese satirically call little fresh meat, 小鲜肉, little fresh meat. These young actors or singers playing these great Chinese heroes of the past like Zhou Enlai or some Chinese generals during the Second World War. I have to confess, I watched one of these films, and the guy playing Zhou Enlai, this guy here, I, I just thought that he's playing Lin Biao in this film, but the guy playing Zhou Enlai, it looks so ridiculous to me when I watch it on an airplane. After 10 minutes, I couldn't watch it anymore. But they do this to try and increase the box office domestically. At the same time, China speaks with many voices, even though they're getting all these Xiao Shen Rou, these little fresh meat people to play. The Academy of Social Sciences did a report saying the CIA has actually turned our celebrities into what they call, I translate it as kind of sissy pants, effeminate males that we have to basically promote masculinity in China, because the CIA plot, going back to what they did in Japan in 1962, it's a very long story, but at the same time, the Chinese film industry is promoting these people. The Academy of Social Sciences is saying these people are bad because they damage the image of Chinese masculinity. So it's a complicated situation. Okay, I've got a lot more slides, but let me stop at this point because at 12:48, I think I've spoken enough. So I'm stopping my share of the screen and turning it back to Jeremy.
Thank you, Stan. That was a really, I feel, and I think I speak for others that, and I see a couple comments in the chat that this has been a really, really enriching presentation. And I think this group would be happy to listen in on another hour or two of this. It's such a nice combination of really solid data, of anecdotes, and of color, and the personalities involved. It's been a real pleasure to listen in. One student I'll lead with here is Jaime Gonzalez asks, notes, this reminds me of how China has dominated the manufacturing sector. And this comment came about 15 minutes ago. So I'm not sure precisely what it was that prompted that. Is there a similar approach to dominate Hollywood? I'm not sure what that could possibly mean, but in terms of in terms of the efforts, you talked a little bit about this this idea of trying to get films out there. And Jaime, I think Professor Rosen did address this a little bit after you gave this comment in the chat. But Stan, I don't know if you have any other thoughts about sort of Chinese attempts to really have these inroads in Hollywood.
Well, sure. Let me give just a quick response. But in terms of the comparison to the manufacturing sector, the big difference now, particularly after 2016, when the Congress has become involved in saying and telling the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, that culture should be considered national security. The CFIUS has to determine in any kind of manufacturing, any other industry, whether Chinese acquisitions of American resources would be a national security issue or threat. And in the past, they were relatively loose. They're tightening up, and certainly in culture, they've tightened up a great deal because culture is now considered in many ways part of national security, as it is in China, of course. So I think it would be very difficult, impossible. There's no chance now for any Chinese entity to buy an American studio, a major American studio. There was at one point, but that's not the case anymore. Even the purchase of Legendary Pictures, which Wang Jianlin and Dalian Wanda did back in 2016, that might not be possible anymore, even though we overpaid, $3.6 billion was overpaid. But, and also China has capital controls which prevent these investments in cultural industries, sports clubs, real estate. They're trying to promote as much as possible investment in Belt and Road initiatives. So they've prevented capital from going outside China. So on both sides, the Chinese government is not allowing it. The American government is not allowing it. So it's not going to happen.
Thanks, and a thanks from Jaime. Also, my colleague Mary Texera sent her great thanks for an excellent presentation. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about Chloe Zhao's acceptance speech, her Oscar
Right.
acceptance speech, and the Sun Tzu reference. She has, as you noted, Eternals coming out from Marvel, right, in November. And it was amazing to see those lists and how crucial Marvel, or how central Marvel has been on so many of those lists in terms of global box office, but also Chinese box office. And so with Eternals, as I think a Marvel film, that's also going to be betting pretty heavily on the Chinese market as well. Chloe Zhao in this space where there are these comments that have been dug up, somewhat innocuous, but maybe a couple that are quite sharp, or the one specifically about being surrounded by lies, and that leading to a kind of netizen outrage, whether that's fomented by the sort of blogosphere or what. But I was wondering, she's going to have to sort of massage that a little bit going into November to make sure that Eternals receives the opening that it needs, and it doesn't get connected with a kind of idea of Chloe Zhao as a traitorous Chinese filmmaker. Did you think that the Sun Tzu was almost a sort of olive branch? That is her reference to the 3-character classic. Is she going to be actively trying to court the Chinese audience and make sure that those comments are behind her?
Yeah, I thought that was a very artful way of making the first step to show, yes, she is Chinese. She's still heavily influenced by Chinese culture and growing up in China. So that answers that one question from the Australian magazine, where they originally quoted her saying, ultimately, I'm an American. And then they corrected the typo and said, ultimately, I'm not an American, I'm a Chinese, which makes sense. I read the original interview, and that makes sense that she said she's Chinese, not American. So that goes part of the way. The lies thing, after all, she was quite young back then, although she's 39 now. So back in 2013, she was already 31, so not that young when she said that. But yet, definitely in our land, she actually spoke Chinese, and initially on Chinese social media, for those people who had a chance to actually see that with a VPN or some other way, there was a lot of outpouring of support for her, which were completely censored. Again, China is taking a self-defeating attitude, it seems to me, by not acknowledging this. Now, the one place that did is in the Global Times, but only in their English language version, not the Chinese version. Hu Xijin, the editor, basically said that she should become more and more mature, serve as a bridge between China and the US, not as a friction point between China and the US. Now, the Global Times earlier, even back after the Golden Globes, said her film should be screened. Because originally, Nomad Land was scheduled for April 23rd, and of course, that's all disappeared now. My feeling is that it's a win-win for both China and Chloe Zhao and Marvel Studios for this to be patched up. China has tried so desperately, as I've tried to talk about a little bit, to claim credit for anybody who's ethnically Chinese, or even Alibaba putting some money into Green Book, that somehow China has more clout internationally in film than it really does. And now you have a real example where you do have someone who was born in China and in a sense grew up under an authoritarian system and is still creative. So that makes the point that you don't have to grow up in a democratic liberal democracy society, neoliberal society, to be creative. You can do it within China. So it's great for China to publicize this and enhance their image, but they're so concerned about anything distracting from the 100th anniversary of the founding. There are so many anniversaries that China is concerned about. There was the 70th anniversary of the founding of the party in 2019. There's June 4th, of course, every year, 1989. There's May 4th, 1919, May 4th. There's so many anniversaries. And now, of course, you have the founding of the party, 100th anniversary. So they're really too much in control, trying to control everything, which to me shows as I tried to do in the book on soft power, in the chapter I wrote on comparing Chinese and American soft power, I tried to argue that their efforts at over control, at managing everything, really is damaging to soft power. So my conclusion was soft power is very low down on their list of priorities, even though they spend over $10 billion a year promoting it.
Thanks, Stanley. And a note came in just a moment ago from Fan. As you were bringing this up about Chloe Zhao's film being banned, and if you have any other thoughts about that, I think you were just sort of speaking on that topic, and Fan sent her question. But did you have any other thoughts about that? To follow up on specifically on Nomad Land.
Well, as I say, I think it makes sense for them to show them. Well, a couple of things very quickly about Nomad Land. I know we have time issues, but Nomad Land is a film that really shows the dark side of the United States, which is why a lot of people in China said, why don't we show this film? It's nothing about China. It's really critical of the United States. But on the other hand, if you look at the original, not novel, the original book on which it's based, the book is much harder hitting. It's an attack on the capitalist system. These people are marginalized by the structure of the American economic and political system. Whereas what Chloe Zhao has done is to soften the film, to give her own sensibility as a film auteur or director, and make it about individual choice. Because I don't know how many people have seen the film, but Frances McDormand, who won Best Actress, has several choices in the film. She can stay with a man who loves her and his family. They're welcoming her. Number one, she can stay with her relatives, her sister. She can stay with her sister. But she chooses herself to be a nomad. It's not the system that has made her a nomad. Even if the system has made her a nomad, she has options. But in the book, people are much more marginalized. So Chloe Zhao has really toned this down. But of course, how many people are going to read the book? So basically, it's a film that does show the negative side of the American economic and political system, and therefore it should be welcomed by China. And so I expect it to be shown at some point after a period of time, and perhaps after the 100th anniversary of July 1st has come and gone, somewhere between July 1st and National Day, and shown in art. It was originally scheduled for the art house cinema circuit anyway. It's a low budget film. It's not a blockbuster. And I think a lot of people will want to see it simply because Chloe Zhao made it. And what's all the controversy about?
That's so interesting. I haven't read the book. I did see the movie, and now I'm looking forward to reading the book. It struck me then, thinking also about Wolf Warrior and some of these other films. There seems to be very, very little concern about offending American sensibilities with Chinese films, major big budget Chinese films. But there seems to be a real concern going back. I remember seeing the film, I think it was 2012. The film was called 2012, and it has the big sort of China comes in at the end. It's a disaster film, end of the world. And definitely China comes in and saves the day there. And in some of these other films like Martian and others that you've noted, there seems to be quite a clear concern about offending Chinese sensibilities because the film will be banned. But there's pretty much zero attention to that. I guess it's on these big budget films, and is it simply because the makers of these films have given up on that international audience, or because it won't necessarily be an issue in the screening and the promotion of the film?
You're talking about Chinese films now, right?
Yeah, Chinese films that don't seem to be very concerned with any kind of political considerations.
No, I mean, you look at Ip Man 4, which has so many people in San Francisco and the martial arts community being incredibly racist toward Bruce Lee, for example, or Ip Man. In fact, a good example of that is Kung Fu Yoga, Kung Fu Yuja, the co-production with India, with Jackie Chan, which was a big hit in China. Indians hated that film. If you look at and I wrote about this actually, in that piece I have coming out in the China Questions, second edition, because it trivialized yoga it was a combination, a co-production. What can we do with a co-production to make money? Well, Chinese have kung fu, Indians have yoga. Let's combine the two. So you end up with kung fu yoga. But for the Indians, it was a travesty, complete travesty. They tried to put Bollywood song and dance in there. And Indians really, critical reviews were awful. So they had no, it was a movie made for the Chinese film market. And they put these exotic Indian things in there, basically for a Chinese audience, not for any other audience. So it's basically domestic market centered.
Thanks, Stan. And that gets into aesthetics and so much more. This is such a rich interdisciplinary approach. Another note from Fan that I'll just read for you. Some filmmakers think it's Hollywood's plan to show China that we don't need your market. We can utilize your people because everyone wants to be in a Hollywood production. What do you think about that?
Well, they may think that, but they're not going to say that for sure. No, I think Hollywood does need the market. If you look at the PEN America report that came out on self-censorship this last year or so, self-censorship of Hollywood film studios, production companies, and so on, filmmakers, when it comes to dealing with China. The point there is, as China showed in 1997, when they banned Columbia TriStar, which is now Sony, Disney, and MGM from having any of their films show in China because of 7 Years in Tibet, Kundun, and Red Corner. These three films, which were never intended to be shown in China, were considered anti-Chinese. Two of them dealt with the Dalai Lama, one of them dealt with the Chinese legal system, Red Corner with Richard Gere. These films were never intended to be shown in China, but China reacted negatively, very strongly, and banned all three studios. And Disney hired, Michael Eisner at Disney hired Henry Kissinger as emissary to try and get the ban lifted. A friend of mine was in charge of China at MGM. She called me from the middle of the night when she finally got the ban lifted. Called me excitedly, saying, finally have the ban lifted on MGM. We can now show our film, because they wanted the James Bond franchise, which was MGM, to be shown in China. And at that time, the market for American films in China in 1997, it only began in 1994 with The Fugitive. It was the first revenue sharing, what they call Fanzhang Pian, first revenue sharing film to be shown in China in 1994. In 1997, the market for Hollywood films was about the same size in China as Peru, the Latin American country Peru, South America. But China acted very strongly back then. And Hollywood has learned from that. They know that your studio is subject only to your weakest film when it comes to China. If you make a film, you look at The Interview about North Korea, which led to the Sony hack. Hollywood is very conscious of not offending. Even a film like Monster Hunter, which has that Chinese joke, which got everybody outraged in China. One of the Chinese characters in the film slaps his knees and says, what do you call this? Something he says, Chinese, because it's his knees and he's Chinese. And of course, that was considered by some people in China to be going back to the way the Japanese and some other foreigners referred to China in the bad old days. And so that film could not be shown in China, or was removed from screens in China. You have to be super cautious in China when you're making a film. But I would argue, as I told the PEN America people, I would argue that a very, very small proportion of Hollywood films reference China at all. You have 2012, the Chinese build the arcs. There's a scene in 2012 when John Cusack and his family come to China, and the PLA meets him, escaping the United States, which is being destroyed. And the PLA comes and says, "Welcome to China." And reportedly, audiences in Shanghai stood up and applauded at that scene. So the Chinese are very concerned about that kind of thing. But that's a very small number of films. Most films, like all the Marvel films, most of them almost all of them have nothing to do with China. So I think it's overblown to argue about the self-censorship issue. That's my take on it.
Thanks, Stan. I wanted to ask about 1 second about the Zhang Yimou film,
Yeah.
which I think ultimately was cut significantly and then released. It was the one that you mentioned with the
right.
Juliette Binoche slide.
Right.
Is there a future where really fine films from filmmakers like Zhang Yimou are allowed to be made and released to an international audience and not at home? I think obviously Nomad Land is not a Chinese film, but this goes back to the sort of 80s and 90s, and we spoke about this briefly. But the fifth generation that were making films, a lot of them not seeing the light of day in China, but then garnering awards, accolades, critical acclaim in the film festival circuit and in art houses in the West, I think especially. Is there a world where that becomes something that's permitted again, or is this sort of anxiety and the really tight lid that's being kept on things the foreseeable future, do you think?
Yes, I do not see that happening. Ten Zhuangzhuang made The Blue Kite, one of the fifth generation filmmakers, smuggled out to Japan, almost frame by frame, won the award at Tokyo for the best film. He made the film in 1993. Chinese delegation walked out. He was banned for making films for 10 years. They did allow him to continue at the Beijing Film Studio as a mentor to young filmmakers, not to make his own films. You have to get any film to be shown at a film festival or outside China, you need two things. You need the seal of approval, what they call the Longbiao, the dragon seal. If you go to a Chinese film, you see the dragon seal at the beginning of every film. That used to be the only thing you needed. Now you need an export permit beyond that, because the Department of Propaganda has taken over. So if you show your films without approval at film festivals, you're subject to being banned in China. And what the Chinese government has done over the years is to delay approval of film until the film festival deadline has passed. Therefore, they don't actually veto the film from being shown, but they don't approve it either. So you have a decision to make as a filmmaker, whether you're going to show your film before you get approval or not. And you can be pretty sure that if you win any award, you will be banned in China. But even if you don't win an award, you may be banned. Zhang won with Gui Zilila, Devil's on the Doorstep. He was banned for 5 years when it was shown at the Cannes Film Festival. When Pingguo, originally called Lost in Beijing, was shown in Berlin, there's a long story, something else I wrote about at one point. There's a long story about that because the film was not allowed to be shown in Berlin because it hadn't been approved with that version they were going to show. They ended up showing, wasn't allowed to be public shown. They had a private media showing, which they argued, the producer and the filmmaker, they argued was actually not a public showing. But the film, controversial film, there's a Fan Bingbing is in that, there's a rape scene in that and some other things. After the film did not win an award, the director said, I'm so glad we didn't win an award because we definitely would have been banned in China if we won the award. What happened was, though, that the film was released in China in a truncated version with some scenes cut out, but someone posted scenes that were cut out of the film online. And because of that, the producer of the film was actually, I think it's finally, the producer of the film was banned for 2 years because someone else, not him, posted those banned scenes online. So the Chinese government is very proactive on all of this. And so I just don't see that changing at all. This tells you what you see with Chloe Jiao now and the way they've reacted in terms of the ban on social media and national and official media, that they still want to control the mess. Control is still most important.
And that, I think one thing that's interesting is that is not new, right? There are a lot of things that are new that people are tracking, whether it's the South China Sea or whether it's the escalation of detentions in Xinjiang. There are a lot of things that are new in the last 5 or 6 or 8 years, but that is something from Jiangwen and Devils at the Doorstep to Tianzhuangzhuang and Blue Kite. That is something that isn't new, and in some ways is a very harsh crackdown that's happening at a relatively well at a period of what looking back now seems to be a relatively liberal moment, relatively maybe.
Yeah.
But so this isn't necessarily new. Do you do you see sort of a qualitative change in terms of the last few years and the sort of Xi Jinping thought and the increasing what's perceived at least as an increasing nationalism from say 20 years ago?
Yeah, I may have to do, I'm co-editing a book on third edition, or actually second edition of a Chinese politics book, and I may do a chapter on culture and politics in China, and what has changed. The whole premise of the book is what is the Xi Jinping difference in different issue areas. And in the area of film and culture, to me, the biggest difference is the propaganda department taking over the Film Bureau. And that does make it much harder to get approval for certain kinds of film. So there's this basic contradiction. They have approved certain films that show the underside or even the dark side of Chinese film. I'm sorry, of Chinese society. I was distracted by a text message. The dark side of Chinese society, a film like Long Day's Journey into Night, which is very good. The Wild Goose Lake, the Diao Nan's film. There have been a number of films that have been approved and have even shown at film festivals and certainly shown overseas, which show the gritty side of the Chinese economic miracle. And so they have been allowed. You do because they don't want to show as China is completely closed off. They want to show China as an important player in the global marketplace. So you have to make some concessions within limits. The other thing is, for a film to be approved, normally there has to be an ending that, if not a happy ending, at least the bad guys get caught. So a film like Dying to Survive, 我不是药神, I'm not the god of medicine, Dying to Survive, that had to change the original story. So the person who was illegally importing all of these drugs from India for cancer patients had to be arrested and serve the prison term. And then when he gets out, the police officer meets him. Sorry to give away any spoilers if you haven't seen the film, but police officer meets him and said, "You don't have to do this anymore. Chinese law has changed. We now allow these imports of these drugs, low-cost drugs, for people with cancer and so on and so forth." So there has to be something like that shows a positive ending for the film to be approved, even if the original story is very different. In the original story, when this guy was about to be sentenced, there were public protests, and so they ended up letting him off with no jail time. But you can't show protests in Chinese films, and you can't show the bad guys getting away. Now, even the film Better Days, which was nominated from Hong Kong, and my speculation is, and not just speculation, is the reason that was nominated, even though it's a Chinese film, was submitted through Hong Kong. It was nominated was because it was Hong Kong, and even one of the reviews I read from the Houston Chronicle said, "This is the film China doesn't want you to see," which is completely ridiculous. Although it was prevented from showing in Berlin originally, and then was later released and made over $200 million in China. But a film like Better Days has to have a positive ending. Now, again, I don't know how many people have seen the film, but it's about bullying in schools and high schools, and so both the young woman and the young man's a petty criminal, both sent to jail, but they both get out of jail by the end of the film after a few years, and then start helping people deal with shy people in high schools, let's say. They kind of comfort them and help them. So it has a positive ending, and that's the way the film gets recut. And at the end of the film, there's a big blurb on the screen, as you always have with these controversial Chinese films, saying that the Chinese government recognizes bullying as a problem. We've dealt with all of these cases, public security has solved all of these cases, and so on and so forth. So it's a positive, happy ending. That's the way you get your film released, even with gritty stuff in there.
That's such a fascinating aspect, because I think of the term Hollywood ending, and I think of sort of Beijing's Hollywood endings, you know, that Beijing needs that Hollywood ending for their troubling films. And if they get that, that's okay.
And then I think of the Woody Allen film, Hollywood Ending. I don't know if you've seen that, but that's
No.
There's a film, Woody Allen film, Hollywood Ending, where too much to talk about it, no time left. But basically, he's a very poor filmmaker, but he goes kind of temporarily blind during the film and hires a Chinese cinematographer who basically, through a translator, tells him how each scene looks and how to set it up. But the translation is completely garbled. So he ends up making complete mishmash. And the studio is apoplectic. This is the first film he makes, so it's completely incoherent. And the ending of that Hollywood ending is the French love the film. The French critics think it's the best film America's ever produced. And that's the Hollywood ending.
That's terrific. I've got to watch that. I have one question in the chat from Suzanne, and she notes that she joined a little bit late, and apologies if she missed any of these questions being addressed. I'll just read her question, and then we can plan to wrap up shortly. And if anybody has any last minute thoughts, please go ahead and type them into the chat. I believe Zhang Yimou had been jailed at some point in China for his filmmaking. Have other Chinese filmmakers been jailed for disobeying the government? I also arrived late to this Zoom meeting. She says, what is the desire for other Asian films in China? Is there sort of a hunger for other Asian films in China? And so thank you for your talk.
Okay, thanks. Two things. One, Zhang Yimou has not been jailed to the best of my knowledge. He has been fined well over $1 million US for having 7 children with different women. He has been temporarily, his films have been banned. To Live from 1994 was banned at one point. Other films have had problems, but he's never been jailed. And I've met Zhang Yimou a couple of times. I just don't see that happening. That would be crazy for China to jail him. I don't know any filmmaker who has ever been jailed for making a film. Banned, yes, but not jail. In terms of other films, Asian films in China, Japanese animation has tended to do well in China. Some Thai films have done relatively well in China, not many. But I would say Japan, on a flat fee basis, has done quite well. A film like Your Name, which I didn't particularly like. I bought it after it had done so well in China, and I watched the Blu-ray of it. And I guess I'm in the wrong demographic. You know, the average age of the Chinese audience, I'm going to be 79 in June, and the average age of the Chinese audience is below 30. So most of the people in their 20s and younger. So that's the kind of film they, I guess, like. Yeah.
Thanks, Stan. If I could, I just want to ask one more question, and that is Hong Kong and Taiwan. Is the dividing line between the Hong Kong filmmaking world eroding, as in are Hong Kong filmmakers who had formerly been relatively free to make the films they want, are they, as in the education system, are those sort of walls between Beijing and Hong Kong eroding? And for the Taiwan part, the Taiwan film industry, is that are those filmmakers eager to make their way into the PRC market as well, and do they have some success?
Okay, a couple of things quickly about Hong Kong. Hong Kong film industry used to be incredibly important in world film, and their market in Southeast Asia, in Taiwan, long before they had a mainland market. in the days of Chow Yun-fat, John Woo, um, Jackie Chan, Jet Li, the 80s, early up to the early 90s, that disappeared. That for a variety of reasons. Michael Curtin wrote a very good article, a book chapter on that, why the Hong Kong film industry declined in overseas markets by overproduction, repeating the same formulas, and a lot of other things. But after the signing of the CEPA agreement, the Closer Economic Partnership Agreement with China in 2003, where Hong Kong films were no longer subject to the quota system. Jackie Chan's Rumble in the Bronx originally, after the quota system was set up, was under the quota system. When it started, it was only 10 films a year, including Hollywood imports. But after the CEPA agreement, Hong Kong films can go into China as if they were Chinese films. And almost 70% of the co-productions are done with Hong Kong historically. And some of the best and most successful Chinese blockbuster films are made by Hong Kong directors. So 80%, 90% of the film market, maybe for Hong Kong films, are mainland China now. So they've become super cautious in what you can and can't do as a result of that. You can't do the violence and sex that were typical of the Hong Kong film industry in the past. In terms of Taiwan, some Taiwan films have done well. Cape Number 7, Jiao Qihao. Cape Number 7 did very well in China, which surprised me because a lot of it is nostalgia for the Japanese colonial period in a way. But there are a number of Taiwan films that did pretty well in China. So there is some market there. Now, going the other way, Taiwan has their own quota system where you have 10 Chinese films playing in Taiwan, but they're chosen by lot. So it doesn't matter how popular, unless it's changed recently, it doesn't matter how popular your films are. They have to choose them by lottery, basically, which films actually get shown. Of course, some films are not shown at all. But the relationship with Taiwan and China, mainland China, is a very interesting one. The Golden Horse Film Festival, that major film festival, Chinese, after a Taiwan filmmaker got on stage to accept her award and talked about the independence of Taiwan, leading Gung Li and other people from China not to go up and make presentations or accept any awards. And the government told Chinese participants, mainly Chinese filmmakers, Golden Horse Festival, you can no longer attend that festival. So that's a contentious relationship too. But before that, mainland films were the most successful at the Golden Horse Film Festival in Taiwan. So that bridge has to be rebuilt at this point between Taiwan and mainland China in filmmaking.
Thank you, Stan. It's been about 90 minutes, so we still have a group tuned in here, and I want to give just a last opportunity for anybody to jump in, and then we'll move to start wrapping up. This has been really illuminating, and it's a little tantalizing to know that there were many more slides that we could have gone through, but this already gives us a lot to think about. Like I said, everything from statistics to aesthetics and everything in between. So it's really wonderful to bring so many different aspects of this this phenomenon to the conversation. Really gives us a lot to think about.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stan. I'll wrap things up from this end, and I'll follow up with you by email.
Okay.
Just to nail down any other details.
Okay.
But thank you. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us, and thanks especially. Please give me a virtual warm thank you to Professor Rosen for joining us today. This has really been delightful. Thank you, Stan.
Okay, well, thank you. I was going to, I don't know what to do. I was using my reactions, but I don't have any reaction that works for me.
Oh, yeah.
I can't applaud myself. I can't give a thumbs up.
Thank you so much, Stan.
Okay, good.
I appreciate it, and I'll follow up. We've got some thumbs up and applause there.
Okay, good.
So,
okay.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Stan.
I enjoyed it. Always a pleasure, Jeremy, to get in contact with you. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Take care.
Bye, bye-bye.